there are more UAV designs out there than you could probably stick with, if you know what I mean. And one big thing that can change how well a UAV performs is whether it has a regular propulsion system or a relatively new system where instead of having maybe one or two propellers somewhere around the UAV, you now have many distributed ones over certain parts. Now this idea isn't new in aerodynamics at least, and some full-size aircraft even have them. But for UAVs and even small passenger aircraft, this idea is quite new. And this idea of having many small propellers distributed along a UAV is called distributed electric propulsion, or DEP for short, DEP. There are many different advantages to this idea. For example, if you position the propellers so that the exhaust from over them go over the top of the wing, then you're effectively injecting so much faster moving fluid that you can really push over the wings to much higher angles of attack without stalling. That is just one benefit. But some ideas that haven't been well explored are how do different wing flap deflections affect depth effects on the wings. So if you have the trailing edge, for example, and it's deployed in like figure 1, if we go up to this figure here, that's figure 2, here we go, figure 1. So it's deployed kind of like that in that little AA section here. How does the depth affect a wing like that compared to when the wing flap is stowed? And another important point is that often overlooked is how does the wing itself affect the propellers? Because we know that the propellers may affect the wing, but what about the upstream effects? Is there this backlash kind of thing? So this is what this podcast is looking at today. How do various wing and propeller configurations perform? And to do that, we're looking at this paper called, if I scroll up, Aero propulsive interactions between UAV and distributed propellers due to their relative size, or relative position, sorry. And this bad boy is open access, and you can find it in the link below. And the DOI is at the end of the page here. And this is a very comprehensive paper. There is a lot of information in it, and I'll try to cover it in one episode, even if the episode is maybe like 40 minutes or so. So anyway, in figure 1, we have the basic wing and the depth tested. So this distributed electric propulsion system. The wing is rectangular, which will then come with higher induced drag because as you get closer to the wingtips, you still produce quite a lot of drag. As such, there is also a lot of lift as well, so there's a lot of low pressure on top and high pressure underneath. So then the high pressure underneath rolls up over on top and a wingtip vortex is produced. That then increases the induced drag. And another important factor here is that the aspect ratio is somewhat short. The authors say that it's about 7. So that increases the induced drag too. So while the authors do say that this is short, and the reason for having such a stumpy wing is so they can fit it in their wind tunnel later on, the greater the aspect ratio is, the wider the wing will be compared to how long it is, and that will lower the induced drag. And there's a whole body of knowledge on that, and it has been largely developed in the first half of last century, and it revolves around something called the Oswald efficiency factor. So if you want to learn more about that, then look up that term. I won't go too much into it in this podcast, but it is enough to know that here, a higher aspect ratio wing results in a higher Oswald efficiency factor, and that reduces the induced drag. Now here, with an aspect ratio of 7, that's not that bad. I mean, there are a lot of UAVs out there with aspect ratios this low, and even small personal aircrafts like Cessnas, they have aspect ratios like this. So 7 isn't that bad. Anyway, the flap covers the last 30% of the wing, so it's pretty big. And the wing has an airfoil profile as shown in this AA section of a LS1-0417. So just some quick information about this airfoil. It has a maximum thickness of 17% of the chord, and that occurs at 40% from the leading edge. So it is pretty thick, if you catch my drift. And it is also cambered slightly with a 2.4% of the chord occurring at 65% from the leading edge. So that camber occurs pretty far back. A lot of other wings are quite a bit forward, like maybe 40% or even 30%, so 65% is very far back. Now, one major benefit of this airfoil is that in turbulent Reynolds numbers, it stalls at a pretty high angle of attack. One disadvantage of it is that its performance is very sensitive to the Reynolds number when you are below turbulent flows. Not only does it stall at like 10 degrees, but the drag coefficient is really bad too. So it's really better suited to like 200,000 Reynolds number or above, particularly 500,000. Now for this baseline wing, as we can see here in figure 1, it was over the wing and then 1 at the wingtip effectively. The 3 ones over the wing are only spanning the flap, so you can see this cross section here, or this top view, lines up with these propellers pretty much exactly where they terminate right at the ends of the flaps too. So the outboard section of this wing, there is none of these three propellers, none of these depths over it. And while the positions of these three propellers are fixed in terms of how far from the wing root they are, so they're this far away, 200 millimeters always. In figure 2, if we scroll down here, we see that there are all these dots, and these dots correspond to different locations that they put these propellers at. So while these general dimensions are pretty bland, just to see here, I'll try to explain in a simple way what they investigated in terms of these locations and why it's interesting. So first, let's start with how up or down the propellers are, so in the Z direction. And let's say we have a wing and you place a propeller ahead of it so that its center is aligned with the leading edge of the wing. So like this dashed line here, these dots here. Generally, you would expect about half the propeller's exhaust to go over the top and half to go underneath the wing. Logically, if you were to move the propellers up, then you would expect more exhaust to go over the top and less over the bottom of the wing. And likewise, if you were to move the propellers down, then you should get more flow over the bottom and less over the top. How? And how that affects the wing's performance? Well, that is what we're here to find out. Also, how will these effects change with different flap deflections? We'll also see that too. Maybe the same trends will occur, maybe different trends will occur depending on the flap deflections. Now that is the Z direction, the height of these propellers up and down. And there are 4 stations here. But the authors also looked at how far in front of the wing these propellers are and how that affects the wing's performance. So in terms of general aerodynamics, that could definitely change the stagnation line on the airfoil because depending on how far in front the props are, the flow has more time to change which side it will go over, and that will definitely change the wing's performance. So hopefully that quick explanation conveys the reasoning behind these two different general locations in the Z and the X directions. Now in table 3, we have all the locations they looked at, and it is really quite a lot to process at a first glance. So I'll just quickly explain what this means. So the left column is just there as a labeling key, and this refers to the depth configuration. The label starts with X, which I don't know why, maybe it sounds cooler or more extreme. The next character is either A, C, or F. So you have A's, then the C's, then the F's. This refers to the horizontal direction, so the X-axis. A means the propellers are closer to the wing, so this closest column here. And this is 10% of the chord further away from the middle position, so it's 10% closer to the wing, so 20% of the chord to the wing as we see from this figure. The next character is a Z, which now I understand why they have the X before. The X refers to the X direction and the Z refers to the Z direction, so the height. And for this character, we have either U, C, D, or B after it. Now this refers to the height as I mentioned, and with these 4 rows here, the U refers to the propellers up 5% of the chord more than the middle position, so more than this dashed line here. So in this location, you'd think that more exhaust should go over the top of the wing and change the lift produced. The C refers to the center position, so the exhaust should be going over about the top and bottom of the wing 50-50, but that also depends on the back pressures. The D refers to down, which means the propellers are lowered 5% of the chord down, and here more and more exhaust should go over the bottom of the wing, and then there's also the B, which means bottom, so B here, that's bottom, so this is the lowest row, and this is 10% of the chord down from this center line here. And again, you would expect more flow to go over the underside of the wing here. So in addition to these different depth locations, 3 different flap deflection angles were tested, and you can kind of see them here in figure 2 if we zoom in a bit. So we have these dashed lines. These positions are 0 degrees, so that's the solid line, and then 15 degrees, which is this middle one, then 30 degrees, which is this lower one. So how these different flap deflections affect the depth performance and vice versa, we'll have to find out. So the researchers used CFD here to investigate all these setups, and they used Star CCM Plus, which is a great safety software, but hella expensive. And if you want to learn CFD but don't want to pay tens of thousands of dollars each year for licensing, then take our OpenFOAM course because you can learn OpenFOAM, which is a completely free CFD software and used by massive companies including Volkswagen, Airbus, and Audi, and is super powerful, and in some cases better than Star CCM Plus anyway. Now, they did this research in 2 halves. The first was on a 2D airfoil, which they say was to explore pretty much the effect of the flap on the wing's aerodynamics. So how the flap gap here, so we have the gap as it goes back, the flap deflection and the overlap, how they change. So they didn't include any propulsion for this 2D case, just the plain aerodynamics of the wing. And once they did that, they then went on the 3D part, which then had the distributed propulsion on there. So this first 2D section, we're just looking at the general aerodynamics of the wing, just to get a good feel of it. So in figure 3, we see the 2D mesh, and it's really cool. You can see just how fine the cells become around the wing. And one thing to note is that because this wing features a highly deflected flap, the researchers assumed that correctly, the flow coming off the wing will be much larger than a wing with a flap retracted. And as such, you can see that the wake going here is being very refined, both in the up and down in this like cone shape. So that should be really good in terms of highlighting the different flow features. So that is good thinking. So the boundary layer mesh consisted of 20 layers, and it resulted in a Y+ value of 1, which is good, particularly because they use the Spallet-Almaras terminus model here, which loves Y+ values around 1. Now this terminus model is pretty good for this setup because the Reynolds number is around 530,000, which should be in the fully turbulent regime, so the Spallet-Almaras model should be able to handle it well. And just for those who might be doing wind simulations and are wondering when to use the Spallet-Almaras terminus model, generally the higher the Reynolds number is, the better it becomes. So if you have like 5 million, then it is usually pretty good. Now for this 2D setup, they ran a grid convergence index, which is a way of indicating how independent the mesh is. The way you do that is you need to run 3 different mesh finenesses, and then you can calculate how much each parameter that you're interested in changes. And in this particular case, for their grid of 323,000 cells, they found that for the lift and pitching moments, during stall, by the way, there was less than a 5% grid convergence index, which is actually really impressive because if this was like at a 2-degree angle attack, the flow would be very stable and steady. So it's much easier to get similar results with a coarser mesh. At around stall, the flow is very unsteady, and not to mention that the stall angle is very sensitive too. So changes to the mesh are extremely amplified at this point. So 5% GCI is really good here, and it will definitely be much lower at low angle attack. Now the authors really don't go into the level of CFD they used, whether that was RANS, URANS, DES, and so on, but there is one brief mention of the state that gives a pretty strong indication of what they used. They say that the flow is modeled as steady and fully turbulent. So I guess that means that they used RANS. The fact that they didn't explicitly say that is a pretty big oversight, an important one. Anyway, I'm pretty sure this is RANS. Now for this 2D setup in figure 5, we can see some nice color plots. And here they say that it shows the effect of the flap position on the lift, drag, and pitching moment coefficients at a 10-degree angle attack. So the top row is the lift coefficient, the middle row is the drag coefficient, and the bottom row is the pitching moment coefficient. Now the left column is for a flap deflection of 15 degrees, while the right column is for 30-degree flap deflection. So this delta F here is flap deflection, and that is a regular nomenclature for aeronautics. Now the x-axis is the horizontal distance normalized to the chord. So in essence, a more negative value means that the flap is pushed more into the rear of the wing, and a positive value means it is pushed more away from the wing. The y-axis is the height, and the flap up or down normalized to the chord. So again, a positive value is that, at least from what I can tell, it's not very well defined here, but from what I can tell, it means that a positive value is the flap is pushed more up into the wing. So going up here, and a negative flap means that the negative value means the flap is dropped away from the wing. Now looking at these plots in figure 5, it's interesting to see that the trends you get at 15-degree flap deflection, so the left column here, whether that is the lift, drag, or pitching moment coefficient, aren't really the exact same as 30-degree flap deflections, so the right column here. In other words, if you were to compare them, you see that they're quite different. For the lift coefficient, when the flap is deflected at 15 degrees, so this left figure here, it's very clear that pushing the flap further away from the wing increases the lift coefficient, so you can see it goes more yellow, like 10%. The same can be true of dropping the flap down. The lift coefficient really increases then like 20%, so that's pretty cool. Interestingly, doing both of those things kind of drops the drag coefficient too. So as you can see in the second row, the plot on the left here, so you get positive changes in both the lift and drag coefficients by doing the same thing with the flap. That's very rare, and that means you can dramatically increase the efficiency of the wing. As for when the flap is deflected at 30 degrees, so the right column here, for the lift coefficient, moving the flap out horizontally definitely helps it increase it, but there's a sweet spot in terms of moving it down enough compared to if you move it too low, then the lift coefficient gets worse. There's a yellow spot here, which is the sweet spot. So that's interesting because for the more extreme flap angle, you can't have it down too much. And the same trend occurs for the drag as well. There's a sweet spot here. And why these are occurring here, I'm not too sure. There are no flow fields present here, but my guess would be that the flap will start to make more of its own wake as you move it down more and more. And the reason why we didn't see that trend when the flap was 15 degrees was because I don't think we've moved the flap far down enough. It's not deflected as much as when you have 30 degrees, and hence you don't get that local maximum. So if you were to increase the Z drop, I think for the 15 degrees, we'll just get that local high as well. But it's great to see that really for both flap deflections, there is a way of increasing the lift while reducing the drag, so you can dramatically increase the lift drag ratio and the efficiency of the wing by doing the same thing. So that is for the 2D case. Let's now move to the 3D case. And for this 3D case, they again ran their grid convergence study in the prop off condition. So it was just the wing and its flap. And in figures 6 and 7, we see the domain with the wing and then the surface mesh in this bottom part here. And the surface mesh is really nice. The leading edges are nice and crisp, as are the trailing edges and around the flap. So they really resolved this quite nicely. Now in figure 8, we see the grid convergence study result for this 3D case. And we have the effect of increasing the number of cells on the x-axis, on the lift coefficient, the drag coefficient, and the pitching moment coefficient as you go from top to bottom. The really cool thing is that these authors tested 3 different angles of attack, 0 degrees, 8 degrees, and 12 degrees, and these 3 angles span most of the wing's operational envelope, so it's very thorough. Above this, I expect the wing to probably stall for this Reynolds number. You can see that really across all meshes, the values don't really change that much, and as expected, the smaller the angle attack is, the less the values fluctuate with increasing numbers of cells. Now, one thing that is really interesting to me is that at 0 degrees, the wing is still producing a lift coefficient of about 1.7, which is really high. Anyway, from these values, the authors conclude that a 8 million cell mesh is sufficient, and it should again be kept in mind that this is with the prop off condition. Now in equations 1 to 4, we see the various values that they measured for the propellers. I'll explain what these are briefly. So J is the advance ratio, which refers to how quickly the propeller is moving through the air compared to the actual vehicle itself. A lower number means that the vehicle is moving slowly compared to the propeller, and a higher number means that the vehicle is moving fast through the air compared to how fast the propeller is spinning. The significance of this number is that it really tells you what kind of conditions you need to optimize the prop for and its effects on the local angle of attack of the propeller. The next number is the thrust coefficient, CT, which is quite easy to understand. Then the next value is the power coefficient, and the final number is the efficiency of the propeller, which combines the 3 previous numbers together. So you can see here, if you increase JCT, that will increase the efficiency. Reducing CP increases the efficiency too. Now, that's about it for their setup. There's no validation here, so let's keep that in mind. And also, as I mentioned, I think they're using RANs, but I'm not really sure how they're modeling the propellers, because if they are using just RANs, then I guess just adding a rotating wall boundary condition is what they're using, or maybe just adding source terms to it, or maybe importing flow fields. I don't know. So there's quite a bit of information missing here, or at least I can't find it. Anyway, let's move on to the results. So in figure 10, we see the wing with the props off, but the flap isn't deflected. So props on and props off. The black line is the prop off, and then the colored lines are for the various prop configurations. The top left is the lift coefficient, while the top right is the lift to drag plot. So lift on the y-axis and drag on the x-axis. So for this right plot, what we really want to see is a steeper curve that indicates a more efficient wing, because you're producing more lift for the same amount of drag. Now for the lift plot here, for all prop configurations, more lift is produced than for the prop off case, which is the black line. But while the lift coefficient is really important, is not everything, because the right plot, as we see here, we get a steeper slope for the black line for all the lower lift coefficients than for the prop cases, which means that for any low lift coefficients, the clean wing is producing less drag and hence it's more efficient. In figure 11, we have a lot of cool graphs, but let's focus on the top right and the bottom right. So figure 11 is down here. So the top right and the bottom right. So this column here, the right one. And these refer to how the lift slope changed with these propellers and how the maximum lift coefficient has changed with the different propellers positions. So in figure 11b, we can see that as you move the props further away from the wing and up, the lift curve slope increases more and more. And moving the propellers closer to the wing, so to the right here, and dropping them lower, reduces the lift curve slope. So it's a pretty monotonic relationship here. What that means that is, if you move the propellers away and higher, you produce more lift as you increase angle of attack. In figure 11d, we have quite unusual trends here because, okay, for every depth location, the angle at which the maximum lift coefficient occurs drops, but there are local maxima and minima throughout this plot. So for example, you can see the yellow region where you move the propellers closer to the wing and drop them down a little bit, so this center right region. But then there are also local maxima when you move the propellers far away, as you can really. So this minus 0.1 value on the x-axis, and then you either move them really high up, you jack them up, or you drop them really low. So overall, I guess the general standout trend is that raising the depth up reduces the angle at the maximum lift coefficient occurs at. Let's move on to figure 12b now. So the top right plot, we see how the maximum lift to drag ratio changes with these different depth locations. In other words, how much the efficiency of the wing changes. And clearly, all configurations are worse than the clean wing. You can see all negative values, but moving the propellers closer to the wing is especially bad, while moving them down is also pretty bad too. So again, a pretty monotonic trend occurring here. Now in figure 13, we get a really cool distribution of the lift coefficient over the wing. As you can see over the wing here, going from the root on the left to the wingtip on the right. And remember that this is for the flap at 0 degree deflection. The top figure is for the wing at 0 degrees, and the bottom figure is for the wing at 4 degrees. And then we can line these up with the bottom figure here, which shows the propellers and how they're rotating. And it is immediately clear, that the region where each propeller is washing up, so the yellow parts here, the lift coefficient is increasing on these plots too. So you can see if you line them up right here, and then the top one as well, the lift increases the local lift being produced. Then a trough is found in the regions where the propellers are washing down. So the blue regions here, they really line up quite nicely with these troughs. Now, regardless, more lift is being produced over the entire region here with these depths than the regular wing. But there are definitely peaks around where the propellers wash up, and that makes sense because the effective angle of attack, so the angle that the wing is seeing, will actually be increasing. But the fact that we get higher lift in the regions where the propellers are downwashing, and that is reducing the effective angle of attack, tells me that there is more than one effect going on here, because if this was just purely changing the effective angle of attack, then the troughs should be lower than the lift produced by the clean wing, but they're not, they're higher too. So it's not just the effective angle of attack, but it's also the other effects that these props are having on the wing. Now in figure 14, the authors try to explain why we are getting these changes in lift coefficient by showing the pressure coefficient plots over the inner middle disk, so the region that upwashes, and then that's the left column here, and then over the outer middle disk, which is the downwashing, which is the right column here. This is an attempt to show why there is also a difference in the lift production between these two regions. So first comparing them to the solid black lines. So you can see the solid black lines in each one of these figures, which are for the clean wing. It is clear that there is more area between the upper and lower lines for the depth ones, which means more lift. The greater these lines are spread, the upper and lower surfaces, the more area in this region, the more lift you're producing. But now when you compare the left plots to the right plots, regardless of whether it is at 0 degrees or at 4 degrees, which is the top row and bottom row respectively, we can see that the left plot has more negative values for the upper line near the leading edge. Once you get to about x on c of about 0.5, then both the left and right plots are pretty similar from there. So what that means is that the actual lift you're getting in this region, where the propellers are upwashing the flow, that comes from the front half of the wing and not the back half. I know that I'm throwing a lot of information out there with new and complex graphs, but the authors have included a lot of information here, and we're just going through these ones, and we'll go through a few more too. They sort of double up, and there are a lot of similar trends. So anyway, let's now continue on to figure 15, where we see the skin friction coefficient distribution over the upper surface of the wing. Let me zoom out a little bit here so we can see a bit more. Here we go. So the top plot is for the XFZU configuration, which stands for the propeller which is very forward and up. The bottom plot is for the XAZB config, which stands for the prop that were closer to the leading edge and really down at the bottom location, 10% of the chord down in that direction. So we can see how the propellers in two different locations affect the skin friction coefficient. Now, this is at 4 degrees. The common trend for both of these configs is that the skin friction drag increases behind the propellers, and that makes a lot of sense because there's much faster moving flow going over the surface now from the exhausts. So that is a major reason why we get more overall drag too. But one interesting difference is that if you look at the regions that have higher skin friction coefficients, for the upper plot, they are straight, while for the lower plot, they're angled more outwards, especially as you get to the third outboard prop. That right there tells you how, depending on where the depth is located, the flow over the wing changes direction, the exhaust. In terms of how much skin friction increases, we're looking at about double more or less. So that is the effect of the depth on the general wing performance. But what about when the wings are affected, how they're affecting the propeller's performance? We know how the props are affecting the wing. What about vice versa? Again, I'm not sure how they modeled this, so this might be a little inaccurate. Let's just keep that in mind. Anyway, jumping to figure 16, which is this one here. So in the last row, coming down here, we see the effects of the wing on each of the propellers at depth 1, 2, and 3 for the efficiency, so eta. And as angle attack goes from 0 degrees to 16 degrees, it is very clear that the wing greatly reduces the efficiency. I mean, we can see values from 1% to 5% reductions, which is huge for a prop. And for the general trends, pretty much the closer the props are to the wings, the worse efficiency becomes. And the authors say that that is because the wing upwashes the flow and reduces the advance ratio of the wing. So the advance ratio is in these plots here. So in other words, the wing reduces how fast the vehicle is moving compared to the propellers, and the propellers have to spin faster to maintain the same vehicle speed. So that drops the efficiency. Another trend is that generally, the lower the prop is, the lower the efficiency becomes too. And the reason for that, I'm not too sure. But if we were to look at the thrust coefficient, which is the second row here, and the power coefficient, which is the third row here, it is clear that each propeller is performing better and not just as efficiently. So for the thrust coefficient, which is this second row here, the closer to the wing you put the depth, the better and higher you put it, the better it performs. And the same trend can also be found for the power coefficient. And all that was for when the flap was stowed at 0 degrees. So what happens now when you deflect it to 15 degrees? Do we get the same trends or not? And this is what the authors call takeoff config. So in figure 17, we get similar plots to figure 10 that we saw earlier. So I'm not going to go through the details because they have very similar trends where we see that with the depth, the lift coefficient of the wing is much higher, but now we also get much higher stall lift coefficients as well, like 1.9 compared to 2.1, 2.2. But again, in the top right figure, we get worse lift to drag ratios because the slopes are worse, at least for the low to medium angles of attack. Now in figure 18, we see similar color plots showing in the top left here how the lift coefficient is being affected, and in the top right how the lift curve slope is being affected, where a greater one means that the slope is greater for the props on. And for the left figure, pretty much every location of the prop is producing more lift, but the sweet spot is definitely where the props are not too far away but not too close, the Goldilocks region, and jacked up. I suspect that that is because more exhaust can be directed over the upper surface and really increase the lift produced. As for the lift curve slope, again, for this right figure, every location increases the lift curve slope, and having props just a little lower than the center line and pushed really far forwards is the best location. You can see that gold region here. The bottom figure shows that all props reduce the stall angle, so in effect, the lift curve is just kind of shifted to the left a little bit and kind of angled up a bit. So in figure 19, we can see that for the drag coefficient, here we go, figure 19, for the drag coefficient, the top left figure here, shows that the minimum drag coefficient is increased for all configurations, which may be because of the skin friction drag increase, which I expect is also occurring here, but we'll see later. In the top right figure, the maximum lift to drag ratio for all propellers drops, but even more so for the lower you put them and the closer to the wing you put them. So it's really a case of the propellers need some space to work. Now in figure 20, we see the local lift coefficient production along the wing. Here we go. So we get the same general trends as before, where in the regions where the flow is being upwashed, so these yellow regions, we get local maxima in those regions, and then when the flow is being downwashed, we get local minima. The rest of the trends are also the same as when the flap was at 0 degrees. So let's just jump to the other figures when the flap is at 30 degrees now. So it's really jacked up or really jacked down. So 30 degrees is, we have more skin friction here as well, as we suspected. So here we go. This one, not that one, not that one. This one, here we go. So figure 24. So again, in this 30-degree flap deflection, we see that the depth increases the lift coefficient again, that slope, and the maximum lift coefficient here reduces, the stall angle reduces and the maximum lift coefficient increases. And then the lift to drag ratio on the right here is again lower at medium to low angle of attack. So these are the same trends as before, where the depths are really reducing the efficiency of the wing, but we are getting a lot higher lift as well. So there's a trade-off going on there. And what we can conclude here is that really the flap angle doesn't matter then, because we saw the exact same things for 0 degrees and 15 degrees too. The same trends always occur. Now in figure 27, we get a slightly different trend in terms of the lift coefficient distributions over the wing. So here we go. If you remember, when the flap was at 0 degrees and 15 degrees, there were very definite peaks and troughs behind the props. Well, here we do get some peaks and troughs, but they are nowhere near as well defined. So I think what is happening here is that the amount of upwash we get out of the props, because in figure 27C, we see that we have much more upwash in the propellers than for the other two flaps. And that upwash really sort of mixes up everything and doesn't make the wing really produce nearly as definite troughs and peaks in terms of lift coefficient over the wing. So for the rest of the figures, we get pretty similar trends again as the other two angles of attack. So that's pretty good. It means that we can kind of conclude that depths are hugely beneficial, and generally, if you move them a little away from the wing, that generally gives the best results. You also want to probably keep them in line or just a little bit higher than the center line of the wing. So this was all done with CFD, and if you want to learn how to do simulations like this and others, then take our courses in the link below. We currently have a Christmas special on if you're interested. And if you like this episode, hit the like and subscribe buttons, and keep your nose clean, and peace out amigos.